Thank you all for being here. Welcome again to Roundtable 2, Specificity and Urbanization, Exploring Territories Around the World. A familiar yet a different team that was active in this, let's say, a second project phase of Studio Basel that started from around 2006, when the Swiss portrait was finished and also published in 2006. And there was, I think, as Cristiano mentioned, even a certain fatigue about studying Switzerland. And there was an urge to look out and think about different parts of the world, different cities. Now, interesting choice was made. The first examples were Naples and Canary Islands, not maybe Singapore and not Tokyo and not Mexico City. And the notion of specificity emerged as a crucial concept in those years, that cities and territories are distinguished by certain characteristics that underpin the kind of production and reproduction of these territories and spaces. This was very different, or stood in contrast with the interest in globalization that was based around the idea of generic city and around the idea that urban processes are driving a kind of homogenization, of places and experiences, around the world. So Studio Basel was looking at what distinguished these processes from each other rather than what made them the same. And in the following years, Studio analyzed, as we heard already, different cities and territories, Hong Kong, Casablanca, Nairobi, Belgrade. These were important examples. But then also territories, very large scales, from Nile Valley, Red River Delta to Brazil, the state of Minas Gerais, for example. And these analysis led to distinctive perspectives on urbanization based on the concepts of territory, power, and difference. Now we will try to unearth what that phase was about. We will talk about the motives of that research. How did this research influence our views? How do we build on that today? How do we see it looking back? And also, what are limitations? What are the contributions? What is the relevance? So, thank you all for being here, and of course, Jacques, thank you. We have to start with you again because of the kind of professorial role and the kind of orientation that you brought in this project. And in this phase, the very first project was Naples, which started in 2003. And as I hinted, there was already a kind of an impetus to go against what was understood at that time to be a trendy theme, to the kind of destinations that have a kind of a spectacular character, and the kind of let's say mainstream that was associated with the interest in globalization at that time. And so Naples was chosen precisely because it was somehow sleepy and not marked by this type of let's say a visible transformation or a generic transformation. And it was thus understood as an interesting example to explore the concept of specificity. So the question is, if you could help us go further with that idea, what were the motives and what was the idea behind specificity?
To call Naples sleep is a bit
yes.
heavy, talking out of Zurich. Well, I have to nevertheless go back a bit, especially for the very young ones here. This is a very personal question. You know, I wrote a text, The Specific City, why are cities differing in the early Nullerjahre, so around after 2001, after 9/11, after 2002, I think, the Notte Nera in Roma. I was always nervous when, you know, theories were around, especially stupid ones. And I was always, of course, in a theoretical conflict with opponents, also architectural opponents, which were proclaiming stupid things that obviously were not true, but also very important philosophers were supporting the idea of reality has gone. Reality does not exist anymore. So even if Christian said, and this is also true, that we look at places naively, innocently, we try to describe what is there. That is the basis. That is not a theory, that's an attitude. But there is a theory behind, or there is a theory insofar that we say, and that was for me important, this term of specific, with specific means species. It is something in itself. It's something that can only be understood out of itself, as opposed to something which is seemingly flattening the world. That was not obvious. Everybody believed that the world is generic, that the world is only shopping, that the world is, you know, countryside. You know, it's worrisome that a lot of the world is not yet urbanized. What a stupidity, you know. And this was a very strong fight against that. And bottom line, it also was supporting the work of every architectural project, because in every single architectural project, you need to dig out specificities and create something which is right for this place and not for another one. And so all these ingredients were important, especially also because, and this is true for, especially to tell the younger ones, the 90s, till the end of the 90s, that was still the time of Thatcher, of Reagan, of capitalism, which has created an incredible boost of beauty, of money, of availability, of endless, infinite kind of growth. And reality is, of course, the opposite. Reality is dirty. Reality is wars, is terrorism, is lack of electricity, of power. All these things did not exist before 2001. 2001, when the new millennium started, that is a coincidence, really, that has changed all our minds. All our minds have totally been shaken up since those 24 years. And now saying the world is specific, the world is real, is like, well, of course it is, you know. But this, of course it is something that needed to be brought into the academic world, needed to be brought into the academic research, needed to be discussed and proved, and was a thread for all of us into, after Switzerland, which is a study about specificity, of course, to find specific examples of this specificity. And when we started with Naples, which is the only one, I think, Roger, where we, the four of us, together with Christian, were working on the same city. Later, we decided independently, 2 and 2 professors, which place we wanted to do. But Naples is still today perhaps the best example. John was also then in the studio. Why? Because if you look at the map, it's a pity we don't have a map, you see the shape of the bay of Naples. Naples is the result of dramatic earth forces. It has this beautiful volcano on which, is still being built. You go exactly where it hurts. You go exactly where ultimate beauty is created eventually through dramatic events. This proximity of danger, of extremism, of beauty and death is what makes that such an interesting topic. And Naples, we found several places, some were better, some were less good, which we found interesting to do what we called drill holes or boreholes. Manny mentioned this before already. This is a very archaic tool to go to a specific place to then what happens around there. And all these things were small ingredients. And Naples was the first city that we looked at with this new method after Switzerland, was encouraging us, I would say, to further work on that field and to find out cities, ideally totally different from each other, in totally different places, also in the global south, not enough, unfortunately, but also there, where we could learn something. We could learn something. We didn't need to prove specificity anymore, but we learned how important it is, and still is now, before you do something, especially as an architect, really look very closely. Look without any biases. Look without any preconceived ideas, because most architects are very preconceived. We all have this tendency because we all have some tricks which tell us how to operate. But more you get rid of this, more you float, and is more courage it needs and more maybe creativity it needs. But this is the ultimate condition to then come to something unexpected and new and innovative. That was altogether why this voyage, this trip towards specificity, examining territories, beautiful landscapes, ugly landscapes, power and diversity, which is a term that Christian brought in from Lefebvre, but ultimately already existed in Lucius Burckhardt's theory. I have to mention this here, that Lucius Burckhardt had created the trilogy of Gesellschaft, Umgebung, oder Umwelt, and Politik. And this is actually exactly our trio. This is then, let's say, to examine landscapes and cities according to these three terms was then the method with which we examined specificity. This is like the tools that helped us look with this kind of unprecedented and unbiased way.
Thank you, Jacques. So we will go back to many of those points in the discussion. So when we are on this paradigmatic example of Naples, we have with us Jasmine Kastani, who was actually Naples was, if I remember correctly, your key project, your main project in Studio Basel, and you wrote together with Christian Schmid a chapter about Naples in the specificity book. So could you speak about that? What was Studio Basel interested in? What were ultimately the points that you emphasized on? So that there was this kind of triad thinking was very important, no? Society, environment politics or territory power difference. These are kind of almost like overlapping triangles, let's say, intellectually, no? Could you speak about your experience on that?
Yes, of course, it's true. My key project with Christian was about Naples. So it was, again, looking through this example, because when I arrived to Studio Basel, more or less all the cities, all the research has been completed. So we tried to focus our research in Vesuvius. So we shifted our focus from the city center, from Naples, to the volcano which was there, which was the beauty of the area, because we are talking about a very natural, beautiful area, and that's the first thing you see, actually. So what we were very interested about was the urbanization of this area. So from the one point, you had what was there, the Vesuvius, how it had transformed the territory, the actual natural territory, because it is an active volcano. It had one of the most famous eruptions in the world. You had Naples chains transformed through the times as it was growing and from the volcano itself. But then when we were starting researching how this area is urbanized and how was the volcano all around this urban area around the volcano, we got to realize that it was actually, although it's a red zone, so you have the Vesuvius, and then it's now a national park, and you have a red zone which is densely populated. You have 18 municipalities, 500,000 people living in an area of high risk, and 2,000 constructions, and 1,000 of them are still illegal. So we drive there with Christian, researching on the field and driving around this area, trying to understand on the spot how it was populated, how it was built. And there was a dense part in the outskirts, like next to the Naples, next to the city, and then there was these magnificent villas, garden villas in the slopes, so exactly under them, in the slopes of Vesuvius. And so what was interesting was to understand that you had, from one hand, something unstable, which was the ground, the Vesuvius, which is active, and it can go active whenever. And then from the other side, you have this rigid artificial grounds, which was the urbanized area of Vesuvius. And on top of that, what was, for me at least, very interesting was the second threat, which had to do with the illegality politics in Camorra, and how Camorra has infiltrated in this area, how they expanded their territory to this area of the Vesuvius, and how they actually turned the whole city and used this as a toxic waste dumps. So we drove through and trying to find these illegal dumps throughout all this area. So it was a very interesting case, because in the beginning we didn't know what to look for, but being there and seeing the mountain and understanding the transformation of the territory, the natural force, and on the other side we understood the built force, the urban planning, which with the legislation, of course, and the legal activities made it even more interesting. For me, at least, it was a very nice experience and very interesting research. And yeah, I was very happy to participate in this project.
Thank you very much. So it reminds me your discussion why I called Naples sleepy, because it was a kind of a spontaneous search for a term. But the point was that this was a city where urbanization process was based on very different forces and not on a kind of massive global capital, right? And that those forces had to do, with informality, with Camorra, with Vesuvius, and so on, and something very different was going on, right? And this conversation became important in Studio Basel, and I will go with this question to Manuel, because you brought in the conversation the discourse on post-colonial urbanism, Manuel Herz, of course, and in particular the book Ordinary Cities that was published around that time, 2006, by Jennifer Robinson, who is now perhaps already our friend, but back then was an interesting scholar whom we didn't know personally. And this conversation was not simply about the choice of research sites and themes, in the manner that we choose them, but also about opening the discourse and the field to researchers and research perspectives from the global south, right? So it was about a different kind of conversation. So could you speak how this idea of ordinary cities, influenced Studio Basel, but also, of course, your research, your projects in Studio Basel?
Yeah. Thank you, Milica. And allow me maybe to step one step back before I go into the idea of ordinary cities. Just before I joined Studio Basel, I came in 2006, I had somehow heard that Studio Basel had started to investigate international cities. So I thought, no, I can contribute something there. And then I joined in 2006, and the first international city that we looked at after I had become a member of the institute was Basel. and I was working with Jacques Herzog and Pierre de Moron, and of course, I mean, looking at Basel with Jacques and Pierre on my left and my right is, I wouldn't say they know it all, but they really know it all. So it was both the marathon run and the 100-meter sprint constantly at the same time. And then I thought, maybe we can, this sounds a little bit hedonistic, but to use the Institute as a vehicle to understand cities that we really want to discover. I mean, discover is a stupid word. That we really want to understand. So how can I also use the Institute as an instrument of this kind of investigation? And I thought I can bring something into the Institute from other geographies, and I had developed by that time some interest on the African continent because I thought this is the continent that is maybe the most misunderstood. And maybe it is exactly some of the tools of Studio Basel that can unravel these misunderstandings and also prevent us from some of the pitfalls. So I suggested to look at Nairobi because it's on the one hand super international and it is maybe one of the key African hubs of urbanization. But then to come back to your question about ordinary cities, I wouldn't say that we kind of discovered Jennifer Robinson, the book, but the book somehow discovered us, I would claim. Because now the danger, of course, when you go to Nairobi or some of these cities is that you fall in love with the kind of, I don't know, poverty, exoticism, strangeness. And I remember it was a trip to Harvard, actually, where Jacques suggested a kind of a register how to approach this condition through very basic, fundamental urban activities, like how do we live, how do we work, how do we go shopping, how do we do activities of recreation. And on the one hand, first, initially, that sounds maybe very lame. No? You don't want to go to Nairobi and look at, I don't know, locations of recreation and residence. But it was exactly maybe the right tool to escape these prejudices and exoticization. Then, yes, it was somehow... it had been written unknown to us in the book of Jennifer Robinson, but I would claim the book found us and not we found the book. And then what started and with this I'll stop, was maybe also a dialogue between these cities, and just to maybe show one or two examples. This register of activities we brought back to Basel eventually, but also, for example, tools of representation. I don't know, we found a fantastic comic book in Nairobi, and eventually made a comic book on Basel. So I would claim as much as this is possible, it was really looking on eye level at whether it is cities of Nairobi, or eventually I went to the Western Sahara, looked at refugee camps. How can you do that with a certain kind of decency, with a certain kind of, I don't know, moral compass, that you don't come with your baggage of whether it's, I don't know, our northern global views or prejudices, but how can we do it in the most decent way? And I think that is an incredibly valuable learning.
Thanks. There is a lot more to be said there. For instance, these themes, exactly those thoughts that you shared with us, I think were very instrumental, for instance, in the founding of the group on critical urbanisms at the University of Basel, for instance, which is a very, very interesting, let's say, research group today. But I would now go back to Bart. So we have sort of examined this post-colonial moment, and now I would go back to the kind of European debate, let's say, in that situation. And Bart, you're an important theorist, architectural critic, and it is interesting in your biography that you have experienced two important, urban research contexts and research mentalities at the time, the Dutch and the Swiss. And you were a professor at the Berlach Institute at the late 1990s, and this is, of course, also how I met you. And in a way, our biographies are linked in that sense. So at that moment, which I remember very well, the school was, let's say, heavily devoted to thinking about the concept of the generic city as it was proposed by Rem Koolhaas. And of course, not, some of that thinking was critical and some of that thinking was uncritical in the way that I remember it, right? So there were people, as Jacques said, who really thought the world should become a generic city, right? In a way that they sort of didn't understand this sort of schizophrenic moment, let's say, in that writing. Or at least this is how I interpret it, but I'd like to really hear about that from you. So a couple of years later, you came to Studio Basel from that context, and then you started to work on specificity in cities such as Hong Kong and Casablanca. And this seems to be like a huge reversal, a huge sort of you were in between these sort of polar opposites conceptually. So I'm curious to hear your take on that. What's the relationship between generic city and specificity?
Yeah, well, I think that in the 1990s there was a lot of research going on. There was also Stefano Buer, for example, working on the Milan region already very early. But I think all these researches have been informed by traditions of the different countries they were in. And when you take the Netherlands first, in the Netherlands, urbanism comes first. That's called before architecture, very different from looking for a building that makes a place special. Then the next thing is the survey comes first. So first there's a survey, sociological survey, demographical survey. Then comes the urban plan, and in the end, the architect comes in and the place is already given. So that is a tradition that goes back to Van Lohuizen, who created the surveys for Amsterdam in the beginning of the last century, and Van Eesteren produced then the urban schemes for that. So you see that also in generic city. Rem writes that the generic city is sociology happening. So you see that back there, and Rem knows that very well from his grandfather. He also knew the work of Otto Neurath already very early on from his grandfather, and so on. So if you then go to the Studio Basel, it's a very different tradition. It is, in my experience, it is very Swiss. But it is with an influence of Aldo Rossi very strongly. So there is an incredible emphasis on morphology and typology. And drawing is very important. Drawing the maps, drawing the sections, drawing in every respect. I remember Emanuel Christ and Simon Hartmann working on that with the students. So there are these beautiful maps that I don't think are equal to anywhere in another place. So that is, I think, an incredible difference. On the other hand, it comes also together. The Berlage Institute was not homogenic. I think that is a difference. There were very different people. There was Winnie Maas, who came immediately from the tradition of dealing with statistics and putting that in plans from the city of Amsterdam. And he made his datascapes, right, that were kind of very abstract, but again, giving the context for architecture and defining this context for the individual architectural project and being more important than the individual architectural project in there. Then there was Raoul Bunschoten, who was very different, was more a situationist, and was much more interested in a lived space and in the sense of Lefebvre, and it was very poetic. And then there was Elias Engelis, who was much more into design projects. And then there was me, and the most Dutch of all, I think. So I was also interested in the sociological aspect that came in through Roemer van Toorn. So we dealt with individualization, and that was a criticism also of what Winnie Maas and Rem were doing, because basically the methods were old and the society had changed immensely. So that was a very different approach. It was about media, mobility, and up to today I'm asked about one study of Jan Kapsenberg that you may remember, which was about the gay subculture and how it manifested itself in this landscape where it was basically invisible. So that was very different. And then there was Stefano Boeri, who became very important because a lot of our work was then published in Mutations. But Stefano came at the moment that he was working with typologies and bringing that to the point, but in this new Milan region, in this new context, finding new typologies, but at the same time, he couldn't catch up with the new typologies because the developments in society were going faster. So he was interested in what Rem was doing and in what we were doing. So in the end, all these methods and people touched upon each other, I would say. Generic City was inspired by Guy Debord, by the Society of the Spectacle, but it gave that a turn. It reversed it, particularly in the end, where you asked to reverse the film in many ways. So, in that sense, the Studio Basel was interested in a much more architectural way, even if the landscape that you see here in the image is a very kind of architectural way, I would say, in dealing with the landscape. And it was interested in this specificity. And I think Jacques explained that very well, that it is about when you go to a city as an architect and you do a building, you have to add something specific. And of course, cities are different from each other. Otherwise, we wouldn't go on holiday. There wouldn't be certain cities more interesting than others for economically. So, and in a global world, of course, specificity is the most important capital cities have. So that was a very important point. It was studied morphological, typological, phenomenological, and so on. So. And then there was this interest in Lefebvre and the lived space. So through the back door, somehow the sociology came back in. So I worked mostly on Casablanca and also for a while on Istanbul, which never happened because of the bird flu. And Hong Kong had already been done before that. And those are two really interesting cities. They're very different, but also similar because they're both port cities, they're both colonial cities. And the colonial regime produced a very different tradition in both cities in the way the cities were made. So in that sense, you could see how these regimes were making these cities extremely specific. And that is, I think, incredibly interesting to consider. So on the one hand, there is the specificity of the landscape, which is obviously in the discussions here today really important and much more present than it would be in the Netherlands, of course, where there is no landscape. But in the end, it is about how you govern also these cities and how that produces difference and specificity.
Thank you, Bart. Indeed, as we heard, I mean, from Jacques, specificity, I think, is something that, or I think this debate has lost, or is not, we don't see this sort of strong polarization in these concepts, right, which were very apparent back then, right? But I think that's also, as you said, that the world after 9/11 has sort of changed, its physiognomy, geopolitics, and so on. And I think we are sort of experiencing, I think sort of different commitments also in research, and I hope we can unpack some of them. So I think that.
Last thing. I wrote also in this early text about specificity, this is not a romantic term, Bart, because I think internationally many have misunderstood this as a typically Swiss romantic term. It has to be specific. This is not a postcard specificity, but global forces, economic forces, but also other globally active forces now in the digital age, I think this is even increasingly more so, are enhancing specificity, are not flattening them, and are creating radical transformation. So specificity is a kind of an illness, is a kind of a sickness of human culture. To be specific and to be have your specific patterns and attitude is, of course, producing beauty, but also is producing the opposite. So it's not at all positive in a classical sense, in a romantic sense. It's just what it is, a species.
But
it's like a poisonous mushroom, but it's also a delicious mushroom.
I mean, you are. If you're talking about negative characteristics, you're hinting about the kind of reproduction of inequality, about the north-south divide, about the urban-rural divide that we cannot break out of, in a sense, right? So I think this component was very, very important. The component of differences, right? And I think we explored it in different areas. But also, it was very important in that phase that territory came back in a kind of a big way. So it was not only about cities, and it was important, and I remember how Marcel was, inspired about it to work again on territories, right? And I think Nile Valley was one of the first cases that had, behind it a kind of learning of the Swiss book, right? So understanding that, like in Switzerland, where alpine brache have appeared, or quiet zones, if we go, for example, to the Nile Valley, we will discover a different kinds of forces, taking place, far away from the big centers, no? And Vesna, I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about that phase, because you were working really on those large-scale territorial studios. I also worked on them, but let's say a little bit at a different time, and those studies have resulted in a book, which is of course now also available, Territory book, in 2016. And perhaps you want to talk about the teams. I mean, I personally find really important that resources were explored seriously, mining, water, food production, agriculture, let's say, and their sort of entanglement with urbanization forces. But also in terms of method, it was quite extraordinary because these were exceptionally large territories, and sometimes also no data was available, right? I remember that Nile Valley we had to draw from scratch, right? We had a research area, and 3 weeks before the seminar, students were like literally drawing the plan of the landscape and the buildings from satellite informations and so on. So how I mean, tell us a little bit more about that work, about the teams, but also about the methods.
Perhaps also to introduce hello everybody, to introduce a bit the term territory. I came in the mature phase of the Institute, I think, in the last 5 years. I think the energy was also a bit different because it was clear that there would be an end, and one was wondering, and actually very excited about this thing that we had not yet worked through, that we should focus in the last years on, which was the relationship. I think the word territory simply, it was already there at the Institute at the time, and it was a kind of tool to talk of a larger scale and to talk about the relationship and influence also that the city has on wider landscapes, on regions, and I think in as a starting point, one physically imagines this being the hinterland and the surrounding landscape around a city. And what we were trying to understand, or what we were seeing, or what was a little bit also challenging to describe, was that urbanization, what later became also the term of extended urbanization was happening also outside the city, and it was not creating city necessarily. So it was, I think, territory was a word that we used to understand. On the one hand, I think on the meta level, the theme was understanding the development of city and landscape together in a kind of interaction. So the impact that the city was having on a landscape that was around it, but maybe also on landscapes further out, no? And also the impact that landscapes were having on the city. There were maybe three words or terms or concepts that we were repeating a lot during those years, which were crucial to why we were looking at it. So the first was globalization. So in fact, the whole difficulty through the globalized economy to even understand the built environment and the transformations that were happening was important to us. So the processes that were created through globalization on a local built environment through the impact of cities was crucial. So this relationship, city and landscape, was kind of the second. Urban transformation was a bit the concept we used, because with urban transformation you can talk outside the city. And transformation was very important as a word, because we were talking about processes, whether they were slow or fast, and we were also trying to set them in this spatial and time categories. That's maybe also with the methods, let's say the visual methods that we needed to describe, no? Third, very important aspect was something we were calling second nature, or in the Territory book also Marcel called it natural characteristics. I think this ties a lot to how we at least try to understand specificity in different geographies. So there were, let's say, local, pre-existing, multi-layered relationship between cities and the landscapes. There were new influences coming from globalization, from the opening up of territories. And there was definitely something happening from the relationship to natural characteristics, to the climate, to resources, and so on. So these three things were actually on the meta level crucial to the analysis or to the approach of why we would study, and somehow then we would get to the how. No, how do we grasp the large scale? How do we, with our urban analysis tools, how do we look onto the landscape? And I think there, what we were, for one, we were trying to develop ways to describe things in very different scales. And for this, of course, it's been mentioned already today, for this, the case study was very important, the small scale, the drill hole, and setting that in relation to something that we're trying to describe on a much larger scale, with other visual means, with the maps, but also other drawing sections and so on. And then putting that through time. So what was there before? What happens in the first change, and so on, until we get the current picture, and we've kind of decoded what you see on a photo, basically. So the complexity is, of course, to say, where do you stop? So we had, for instance, chosen to work in the Red River Delta, to go to Hanoi in Vietnam, and in this defining kind of what to work on in our preparatory trip. Just to give one example, it was very important to include the port city of Halong Bay and the industrializing corridor between Hanoi and Halong Bay. That is somehow also cutting through the polar landscape of the Red River Delta, with the agriculture fields and the very capillary, intricate water management systems. So somehow there was indeed a kind of openness to the approach, but on the other hand, one had to consider if we want to study the impact of globalization, or if we want to study the relationship of city and landscape, what do we need to look at while we're in the Red River Delta? No, it was a little bit maybe also hit and miss at times, but we were often having questions, or we were often having hypotheses that then would be worked out in a very brief period of time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think this, for me, this ties back to the point that we hear still often. Cities are the problem; they are also the solution. For me, the kind of epiphany with the territory was, came with the Nile Valley, the case where we spoke about the urbanization of limited resources, where, the territory seems to be growing ad infinitum, but, there is no water, there is no land. How is this even possible, right? We were able to explain that, no? And so this is very interesting, and somehow the understanding that by looking at cities, we are essentially limiting our view in a way that we are missing, in fact, the bigger picture, right? So that we need this sort of a view from the inside, but also from the outside, right? And we need to bring the landscape in the kind of in a sort of a different paradigm of research, but also design, right? So I think that was, in a way, the kind of way I began also to understand specificity. But so I want to then move to Ying. Ying Zhou, one of crucial collaborators in this period, working on several large research projects, Beirut, Damascus, also Metro Basel. And it is interesting, we spoke a couple of days ago, you're today a professor at the Hong Kong University and you teach architectural design, which, building upon these years as a researcher is a kind of an interesting reversal. So I want to ask you, how do you look back today on this urban and territorial research, and how do you situate its values? I mean, is it, is there space at Hong Kong U to work in this kind of way, right? Or should there be?
Huge questions. Firstly, I wanted to say thank you so much for this occasion, and of course the wonderful gathering to reflect on this achievements of Studio Basel, where I was in 2007 to 2010. So I was very fortunate to have joined the research publication of the Metro Basel comic book, a continuation of my own and many of our colleagues' master's thesis at the GSD in 2007. And the following 3 semesters of research and teaching on Kolkata, Damascus, and Beirut, and Cairo were extremely formative for me as an architect, intellectual, and teacher today. I have to say, I actually wrote this for the 3rd panel, so there's a bit mix of many things. We are in a strange juncture, actually, today, where the so-called artificial intelligence, actually a misnomer because it is a very smart average, is wreaking both great anxiety and great optimism simultaneously. The questioning of fundamentals in this way of thinking about live, work, the city itself, and the capacity to distinguish in the midst of ever greater quantities of data. We all know about big data. And the specificities, as Jacques just said, the species, the unique, the exceptions, the outliers, the illnesses, and through the particularities of drill holes and fieldwork that we did for all the semesters in the field, rather than the pattern of averages, thus becomes even more essential to the agency of architecture as both a discipline and as a profession. I'm coming from a part of the world, our little planet, where half of the world's population actually lives, and where urbanization has been taking place at scales and speeds unprecedented in human history. So it is here where I teach that the rigorous research of basics, so what Jacques, you just said, looking without the preconceived notions, especially as architects, because they constrain us, they give us limitations. That is really at the crux of architectural teachings at Studio Basel, and that, for me, is extremely crucial today. And it is precisely in our present confrontation with the irreversible ecological crisis that we face, and being myself also in a context where rapid demolition-based constructions to make progress and prosperity is the norm, that I draw on the methods and frameworks of Studio Basel in showing the capacity of architecture to bring together form with meaning, form with history, form with aspirations, not only form with form. For me, it was the palimpsests of Cairo and Damascus that revealed the flows of globalization, both pre-modern and since the age of conquest. It was also in the transition economy of Damascus where I first tried to distill the idea of an urban loophole, a concept framework also for spatial productions and urban governmentality that I would later unpack in my own home city of Shanghai. And it was in Kolkata's wetlands and Howrah that I first encountered political ecology and critical infrastructure studies. So, of course, Basel for me was really the bricks and mortars of urbanism, and the experience of going to the international city of Basel with Manuel and Jacques and Pierre was wonderful. That space, the domain of architects, manifests actually larger forces, as you just mentioned, whether social, cultural, or political, economic, is something I underline today to my own architecture students, themselves confronted with ever newer technologies, but burdened with the narrowing of our profession. The artist Ai Weiwei once said, "If we don't know where we come from, we are standing nowhere." To truly know where we come from is something that my time at Studio Basel has imprinted on me and I hope also to be able to share with my own students. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful, Ying. Thanks. Yes. It's a time to wrap up, to end this panel. Perhaps as a last reflection, I would like to think about this, to think about our own orientation in research. When are we looking out and when are we looking in a way, or toward our own, to say so, locality, or when are we learning from other places? And learning from was an important idea, right, in this entire phase, right? What can we learn from these different places, encounter situations? And it seems that one of the important reversals, that took place between, let's say, then, the times when we worked on these projects, and now, is that we are aware in a very different way of, as you mentioned, Anne-Sophie, Anthropocene, of climate crisis, of biodiversity crisis, of resource scarcity. I think those themes have amplified, right, in our consciousness and in our research orientation, but they also require to somehow, a certain sort of more inward, or a kind of more localist approach, right? And I want to ask you, perhaps, Manuel, how do you see it?
Thank you, Milica, for giving me the chance to respond to that. And maybe what I will say will sound a little bit, I don't know, like a lament or nostalgic. But when I think back to the years, I don't know, 2006 to 2016, 10 years, there was really a kind of an excitement of trying to understand urban conditions outside of our, sorry for saying this, bubble of luxury and stability of Switzerland, and seeing and trying to understand how other people make cities, and of course making this reflect back onto us, learning from Las Vegas, learning from Nairobi, learning from, I don't know, Kolkata was incredibly important. And now we see ourselves in a very, very different era and mentality where, and we all know this, where I don't know, studying something that lies beyond the reach of a bicycle or the train becomes almost impossible. Not only for ecological reasons, no, we don't take students anymore to Nairobi. It just doesn't happen anymore. But also for, let's say, reasons of interest. No, there's an incredible rediscovery, which is good, of local resources, local traditions, local histories, local whatever, everything, local cities. But I think there's also something, and there I don't have a good answer, and maybe the next panel has the answer. I see a certain kind of danger of our bubble being there's this great German word, Nabelschau, celebrating ourselves, how great our Swiss valleys are, and forgetting that how to reflect critically upon our own condition, and because we don't travel anymore beyond the reach of the train line. And I wonder how we can, if there's an anecdote. I just came from a jury for an Swiss Architectural Award, and the blurb I was writing is to an architectural office that is doing amazing work in Switzerland and is also recognized internationally. And this phrase was erased by my colleagues. We are not interested if architects are recognized internationally anymore. This should not be a parameter in judging architecture. And I think, hell, where have we gone? I think this is really dangerous. And so how can we balance, of course, the fascinations of the local with the desperate need to critically assess ourselves from a foreign standpoint?
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was the second panel.